in the road to recovery. We have lots of folks joining us, and we're going to give it a couple more minutes before we actually start. But just so everybody knows, we are recording this session, and it'll begin in a minute or two. Welcome. Okay, welcome again, everyone. Let's get started in the workshop. It's going to be 3 days of fun. We're excited to have you all join us this morning for the first day. This is the third workshop in the series of Road to Recovery. I am Paul Schmidt. I'm the interim director of the initiative Road to Recovery and had a career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Ducks Unlimited. Again, we're excited to have assembled a great lineup of presenters and panelists to help us all find ways to improve our conservation results in sustainable recovery of birds. We're grateful to all the individuals who have worked to bring this to you and the organizations that have sponsored this, including the American Ornithological Society, North American Bird Conservation Initiative, Partners in Flight, and all the organizations who have contributed staff to organize this workshop and the initiative itself. A very special thank you to the Knobloch Family Foundation for their significant support to this effort. Without them, the Road to Recovery wouldn't happen. Now for some of the details in the workshop, more of the logistics. So as you can see on your screen, based upon comments from the previous workshop, we have disabled the attendee to attendee chat. But if you'd like to make a comment, please use the workshop Padlet, and a link is going to be provided to you in the chat. Please use chat to panelists only for logistical questions or problems. Use the question and answer on the button, Q&A, at the button in your screen, only for questions to the panelists. And you'll have opportunities through this 3 days to provide questions, and hopefully there'll be enough time to get all of them answered. Unfortunately, we were not able to provide live language translation. However, you can turn closed captions, it's in English, on or off using the CC toggle at the bottom of your screen. The latest agenda and other items related to the initiative, including all the recordings from the previous workshops and eventually this one, are on the website indicated on the screen. So let's look ahead and get started. As I said, this is the third in a series of workshops designed to advance our collective work on recovering bird populations. For the next couple of days, we're going to be focusing on building upon the biological science work from workshops 1 and 2. We want to explore how we might do a better job of integrating social science, co-production, and communications into the road to recovery. A big thank you to Pete Mara, Ken Rosenberg, Tom Will, Brant Ryder, and so many others for not letting the 3 Billion Birds publication be just another report without action, and for inspiring me to get re-engaged in bird conservation. As we make our way through the next couple of days, we want to explore and discover together. Keep an open mind to how we might do things a bit differently in the future and to be successful in recovering species. Today, we'll focus on giving us all a foundation on co-production, social science, and communications in bird recovery. It's been a year and a half since the publication and the news of the net loss of 2.9 billion birds in North America, with more than 300 species in decline. The publication succeeded in getting everyone's attention. Despite this coming out a year and a half ago, this is still a moment in time for conservation that has a chance to help change our human behaviors and the way we professionals work to conserve birds and ecosystems. In this presentation, I'll cover the rationale for reimagining bird conservation, which leads to the creation of the Road to Recovery Initiative and our primary goals. I'll talk about our approach and proposal to tackle the issue of bird declines, as well as the 3 goals of the R2R, its vision and guiding principles. We've been building to this workshop through the first 2 that focused on the biological science in recovering populations. We want to focus on integrating the human and social side to recovery in this workshop number 3 and begin to map out or explore the next steps. In the 1980s, it became clear that bird declines were significant, leading to lots of new structures and organizations to further the work of bird conservation. Think North American Waterfowl Management Plan, Partners in Flight, American Bird Conservancy, joint ventures, and so many more. Still, 35 years later, we must face the facts that declines continue at an alarming rate. Our conservation efforts are not meeting the challenges we face. So, we know the declines are occurring, and we have ideas about the broad threats. Despite this knowledge, species continue to decline. The R2R vision suggests that we haven't focused on species enough and need to take full advantage of the advancements in science and technology in our recovery efforts. We are not suggesting that broad landscape conservation is not important, because it is. But without a more focused effort to strategically recover species within the context of landscape conservation, we may not be successful. The Kirtland's warbler had decades of conservation work, and it wasn't until it was listed as endangered that efforts increased to the scale needed to reverse the decline. Our challenge today is that there are many species that are headed in the direction of the Kirtland's warbler. More species are heading to the endangered list, and so this will mean that more species will be threatened by extinction. Our capacity will be stretched thin with a focus on regulatory processes, and will cost hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more. We need to understand what is not working. Traditionally, we would be asking questions to ourselves like, is the science precise enough? Do we know what the actual limiting factors are and how to address them? Are there enough resources and capacity? Who's going to take responsibility or be accountable for bringing back 3 billion birds? These are still important and relevant questions, but in the context of this workshop, we should be asking ourselves questions like, are strategies well informed? Or perhaps, should we dedicate more energy to better understanding human behavior? Is there adequate interaction between science producers and science users? Or is the science failing to inform conservation? Do we have a lack of communication amongst partners and affected people? Road to Recovery was born in 2020, an initiative to tackle the declines and focus on recovery of species populations before they are listed, acting in a swift, targeted, and strategic manner. R2R believes in engaging broad spectrum of collaborators, including ecological and social scientists, land managers, private industry, policymakers, and this throughout the hemisphere. It is interdisciplinary in nature because we want this to be successful. Currently, R2R is an effort guided by 17 members of an organizing committee that represent the sectors of academia, government, and nonprofit organization. Our vision is to use targeted and actionable science to recover North American bird populations and lost abundance before they become endangered or extinct. This is our niche, to work before the species get listed. Our approach involves deciding which species to focus on first, targeting research to fill critical knowledge gaps to determine limiting factors, figuring out how to collect the data we need, and using research and existing data sources. And then making sure this new information makes it into the conservation plans and to managers who can implement these actions on the ground. It's important to note that we don't see implementation taking place at a species by species scale, but we need to have recovery modules for the most urgently declining species. Incorporating and integrating social science and co-production into this process is critical and is the focus for our next couple of days. We propose 3 main goals to achieve recovery: develop a process for management and recovery of species on the brink, promote targeted and actionable science to recover bird populations, and to increase efficiency and effectiveness of implementation. Our first goal is to create a process for management and recovery of species on the brink. So for these species on the brink, goal number 1 is creating or supporting existing recovery teams. The inspiration for this comes from existing modules. We've recovered species when we have the will and the resources. The Kirtland's warbler had its own road to recovery. Concerns were raised as early as 1940. After 1940, surveys continued to track the declining population, and by 1970, there had been a 60% decline of that species. Efforts were taking place in these decades, but the species continued to decline. The Kirtland's warbler was listed as endangered in 1973, and this created a recovery team and the creation of a plan aimed at increasing the numbers of the population. By 2001, the conservation work led to significant increases in breeding pairs, and by 2018, the species was removed from the endangered species list. And we'll hear more about this recovery and the other species in the workshop. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for the recovery of plants and animals listed as endangered, and recovery teams are a part of that success. We believe that we need to have organized recovery teams before the ESA listing occurs. The model will likely be different in Canada and Mexico and other countries, and we'll hear more about that as well in the workshop ahead. So goal number 1 has specific objectives that include identifying and creating a recovery team led by a recovery team coordinator, a person who is dedicated to this effort on a species by species basis, and where appropriate, for multiple species in an ecosystem. But it won't be a part-time job. It will be their focus. Our second goal is to promote targeted and actionable science to recover bird populations. First, we need to assess where each species would fall along the road to recovery. We have assessed each species in terms of where they are along the road to recovery. The majority of species have little to no information in terms of why they are declining. Good example is the evening grosbeak. For other species, such as the pinyon jay, a working group has formed and a first draft of conservation plan developed and some research, but we know very little. Then the golden wing warbler, for example, with a whole initiative in terms of research and planning on both breeding and wintering grounds, but still don't really know exactly where the species is limited. And then there is the salt marsh sparrow, an example where specific management actions and costs to address a limiting threat are being used, in this case, sea level rise. A good example of a recovery plan for a non-listed species. And we'll hear more about that in the workshop as well. The important point here is that beyond managing habitat or addressing broad threats, we also need to focus on recovering populations. We aim to advance species to the point where recovery is happening. In order to advance species from one level to another, we need to increase the specific knowledge we have for that species and begin to understand the cause of the decline. Start with basic research, filling knowledge gaps, groups of experts coming together and developing conservation plans. And finally, developing and implementing strategies that reverse the declines and indeed recover the populations. But to have actionable science and to enact one of our guiding principles, we must use social science and work with landowners and managers and other affected parties early and often. The workshop will help explore how we integrate these elements better. Recovery has two components: understanding species biology, or what science is needed on a species by species basis, and two, a human component, because the work will be done by people and the conservation actions impact people, and frankly, most of the problems are caused by people. An intersection with human dimensions is necessary to eliminate the implementation gap. The first step is to recognize who are the partners based on the species range and the habitats, and recognize the resources and the resource priorities. The co-production of research strategy is the action of co-producing with partners the ideas for research and management. This step is iterative and it requires an understanding of the partners' values and their needs. Once the work has identified the limiting factors and co-production has identified the key partners, it is via co-production and through the recovery teams that the feasible and strategic actions for recovery are identified. Our third goal is key to make this process of recovery replicable on species by species basis. We have been working on this goal by establishing connections and meetings with a wide variety of organizations, including government, nonprofit, and for-profit entities. During these meetings, the message of 3 billion birds has been emphasized, and we have received enthusiastic support for the R2R initiative, recognition for the critical need to address birds on the brink, and we have a complete agreement on the need to keep species from being listed endangered, and we found a willingness to consider partnering on all these projects. We continue to engage the conservation partners through these virtual workshops. The first workshop was aimed at identifying causes of bird declines. We had over 100 attendees to that workshop. The second workshop in December explored new technologies in identifying causes of bird declines. It was entitled Linked Populations, Migratory Connectivity and Demographics. And there, about 500 participants. And now in this third workshop, we will explore how to advance species towards sustainable population recovery, beginning with species on the brink. And we have over 400 registered for this workshop itself. I want to thank a wide variety of professionals who have planned this workshop and have been actively participating in its development. And a special thanks to Fabiola Rodriguez and Tom Will for all the behind scenes work that has got us to this point. You'll hear more from some of them in the coming days. And now let me introduce today's plenary speaker and moderator for the day. Ashley Dare is a professor of Virginia Tech in the Department of Fish and Wildlife Conservation, where she conducts social science research to address bird conservation challenges. Most of you know Ashley. She is well known as a champion for the integration of social science, strategic communications, and co-production, an approach to bird conservation. Welcome, Ashley. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate your opening remarks and all of the consideration of the human aspects of bird conservation. Thank you as well to all of you who are joining us here today. We're over 300 people currently joining in for thinking about this really important topic about how bird conservation is fundamentally a human endeavor. And to build an argument that it is important for us to be thinking about people in all of the aspects of what we do. I want to start first with a land acknowledgement. This is the image of the field behind my house where I am currently in Craig County, Virginia. Our land acknowledgement at Virginia Tech is that we acknowledge the Tualamonacan people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live. And we recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air. I encourage you as well to think about the Indigenous people who also have continuing connections to the land, water, and air where you're based. All right, I'm going to start with a story. So despite being known as a champion for social science today, I began my career in conservation on the biological side. My first job out of college was as a field biologist studying birds in Hawaii. Helicopters dropped us off in remote field camps at high elevations on Maui. There we spent 6 to 10 days at a time running around the rainforest catching Hawaiian honey creepers like the EEV you see in this image. Our project was fondly called the Po'ouli Project, as this single species was our primary focus. At the time, the bird was thought to be the world's rarest bird. In 2001, when I worked there, it was limited to just 3 individuals. Yes, that's 3 individual birds anywhere in the world. And to make matters worse for the Po'ouli, the 3 individuals never saw each other. In fact, they had an identity crisis of sorts. They thought they were Maui parrotbills, spending their time with other family groups. Our task, which was flawed from the start, was to catch and translocate a female bird, take it to the home range of the male bird, where she was going to meet the love of her life. But unfortunately, after weeks of trying to catch her, we finally did. And when we took her to the other home range, instead she did what most biologists predicted would happen, simply flew home. And sadly, the people of Maui and all the visitors from the mainland didn't know what was going on high up on the volcanic mountaintops. They didn't know that Hawaii is the endangered species capital of the world. They weren't bothered that the birds that sang to them early in the morning came from South America or Asia, rather than their own island. Yet, without human interest in conserving the native birds on the tops of the mountains of the island, pigs would continue to tear up habitat, creating perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Feral cats would continue to eat chicks, and disproportionate conservation funding would flow to Hawaii in comparison to the severity of the endangered species crisis Hawaii was facing. And the Po'ouli's eulogy would be read only by conservation biologists. The last Po'ouli was brought into captivity in 2004, where it died. This photo of the museum specimen of the last bird haunts me. Because of this experience, I decided to pack up my biologist field gear and work in less idyllic, more populated locations, understanding the drivers of human behavior. and how to engage people in conservation action and the work of conservation itself. Became a social scientist, also known by some as a human dimensions researcher. But I didn't close the doors on my biologist colleagues. I'm here today. Instead, I focused my career on building meaningful bridges between biologists and social scientists to affect bird conservation. So what are the human dimensions of conservation? Decker and colleagues have described the human dimensions of conservation as everything in conservation or management that's not about wildlife and not about the habitats. Pretty broad definition, but let's take some examples here. So when we talk about the human dimensions of conservation, we're talking about this image. When you look at this photo, what do you think is going on in this woman's mind? How does she feel? What does she think and feel, or why does she think and feel these things? What does it mean she's going to do as a result of this experience? Why? What do you think when you see this photo? Is it the same or different as what she's thinking and feeling? Is it the same thing another person on Zoom is thinking and feeling? What about you and your experiences, your values, your interests, and where you come from cause these differences and similarities? These are questions of human dimensions that can be addressed by social science. This image also raises questions about human dimensions. What's going on in this photo? What are the people thinking? How do they feel? Why are they protesting, but others in the area are not protesting? Or why is it that there's a counter protest on the other corner? What do you think and feel when you see this photo? Are you ready to jump in and join the protesters? Or are you ready to run the other way and hope they're not calling your office? These are the questions of human dimensions. Two very different settings, both about people and birds, and can be addressed by social science. So this image too, that you all are probably quite familiar with from the campaign associated with the 3 billion birds, is also fundamentally a question about the human dimensions of bird conservation. We see that bird populations are in decline, and we've lost individual birds of a great magnitude since 1970. Yet we've had quite a bit of biological science and ornithological research. In fact, there's hundreds of people across the US, maybe even thousands, who work on bird conservation, but our bird populations are still in decline. What is it about how we do conservation? Why isn't science resulting in appropriate conservation? Is it the decision makers don't know about it? Is it that we're not asking the right questions? Is it that we're not making our science usable so that others can actually implement it easily on the ground? Or is it that there's not political will to implement the necessary changes? These as well are all the questions of human dimensions. I want to take a little bit of time to think more about this last set of questions, because it's a great foundation for a lot of what we're going to be talking about in the workshop today. Probably a lot of you are familiar with the term implementation gap. It can be defined as knowing but not doing, or science failing to inform conservation. And there's a growing literature over the last couple of decades associated with the implementation gap. Probably some of you saw me give a talk at the Northeast Bird Conservation Conference almost 10 years ago, where we really tackled this implementation gap idea. And in that presentation, Ken Rosenberg and I shared this figure that's based on the literature about implementation gaps. And in the implementation gap literature, it says that there could be a gap in two different places. One, between our assessment about what's going on related to species and the actual conservation planning and design, or it could be a gap between conservation planning and design and implementation. In that presentation, Ken argued that he thinks more of the implementation gap is between conservation planning and implementation, because we've done a pretty good job in bird conservation of writing conservation plans. And in those conservation plans, we've put a lot of work into incorporating the best in recent ornithological research, that research that we constantly are interested in trying to refine. And the last two workshops have talked about how we can keep refining it. And in there, we call for changes for birds and for habitats and addressing their threats. We also, in those conservation plans, tend to lay out a bunch of strategies that are fundamentally about people. And they call for changes in terms of policy. They call for changes in terms of engaging people. But what's often missing is we don't have the social science know-how or the social science information actually informing those strategies. While we pride ourselves on science-informed plans, they're only informed by the biological research and rarely informed by the social science research. And there's certainly exceptions to that, and kudos to those who are doing so. And then as we move towards implementation, we additionally have to be very involved in strategically engaging people in those actions that those plans call for. And that too can be missing or limited resources spent towards it. And then finally, another key component that we've done more effectively in some places than others is we need to have scientists and practitioners involved in the entire phase of our work, both informing the assessment and how it moves into planning, and then also moving from planning to implementation. We tend to do a really good job of getting the scientists in the first part and a really good job of getting the practitioners, or hope for a good job of getting the practitioners involved in the second piece. But we really need all of us to be involved all the way through. So basically in blue, we have an issue of social science and human engagement needing to be more of a priority, and in green, co-production. So I'm going to talk about these concepts here and how we can integrate this in our approach to bird conservation. So let's talk about integrating social science first. So conservation social science is a growing field. If you haven't read this paper by Nathan Bennett and colleagues, I highly recommend that you read it. It's an excellent primer to conservation social sciences. And it lays out that there's a whole array of disciplines. While I often get called a sociologist, I'm not. There's many other disciplines that are part of the social sciences, a subset of the classic and applied social sciences, and they focus on conservation and environmental management. The social sciences can help us understand a variety of questions. And I'm going to share with you here a set of questions that come from a paper my colleagues and I wrote that's been recently published in the Condor that focuses on the social sciences related to bird conservation. We lay out that you can ask questions like, why do or don't people care about birds? What factors contribute to the human behaviors that benefit or threaten bird populations? What kind of messages or other human engagement methods are effective at changing attitudes and actions towards birds? What are the livelihood impacts of bird conservation efforts? This is a really important question that we're not so good about asking in bird conservation arena. And there's certainly some of our partners and organizations that have really made this a priority though. And then also, how can policy be structured to support bird conservation across landscapes and geopolitical boundaries? Now, there's also a pretty robust literature that looks at what are the barriers to integrating social science in conservation broadly. I'm an optimist, so I'm going to focus instead on what are the solutions to addressing those barriers. Nathan Bennett, again, in the paper that I shared with you all, along with his colleagues, lays out 4 key steps that are really critical to thinking about overcoming the gap in integration of social sciences. One is we need researchers and practitioners to gain social science knowledge and skills, getting that into undergraduate curriculum, graduate curriculum, and then also training opportunities for folks who are already graduated from their degree programs, involving conservation scientists in conservation efforts and conservation studies from the beginning. While folks can be trained to have familiarity with social science itself is its own science, and certainly takes extensive training and experience in order to be done well. And then also integrating social science into conservation planning and implementation, as I called for in the image that I shared with you previously. And I just lost my screen. Interesting. Okay. I think someone just tried to share their screen. Is mine good? Okay. Someone in the chat pod mind telling me if everything's okay, it just all flashed off.
Your screen's back up, Ashley.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, trying again there. All right, so, and then of course, building conservation social science capacity in organizations and agencies. So key ways to do this, connecting with the initiatives that have social scientists involved in them. And several of the bird conservation initiatives do, including NABC, the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, and then there's also a Human Activities Committee of AFC, the Atlantic Flyway Shorebird Initiative. Then there's also ways that you can find individual social scientists who may not be plugged into the bird conservation world, such as the Conservation Social Sciences Community Network. And in this great database that's based online, there's a web map directory where you can find the name, location, organization, and professional expertise of social scientists. One thing I did want to point out about this map is oftentimes social scientists, just like biologists, work in an area that's broader than where their office is located, but it's a great starting point for you learning about social scientists who might be good collaborators. And there's a variety of existing resources that are also available to folks, such as HD.gov, and it has an excellent new overhaul and includes information and resources and training modules, et cetera. And then the North American the North American Bird Conservation Initiative also has a variety of resources. This white paper that my colleagues and I wrote looks at how joint ventures can incorporate human dimensions into their implementation plans. And I'd argue that it's just as relevant for the species working groups as well. And then finally, there's an excellent repository of success stories that the NABC Human Dimensions Working Group has put together as well that can build a case for putting effort into social science integration in bird conservation initiatives or in your organization. And we'll be hearing from a couple of those examples here today in our panel that follows. Okay, so now let's shift gears. I've shared with you the importance of social science, how you can think about integrating social science, how you can start to take steps to do so. Now let's think about engaging people through communications. I want to start by acknowledging that there are a variety of ways to engage people, and I recognize that. Solafsky et al. Has a nice framework that describes 4 main categories: protection and management, law and policy, education, outreach, and communications, and then also things like incentive programs. We don't have time to talk about all these ways to engage people. Social science can help inform which way is most appropriate for the work that you're doing. I want to focus on the communication side of things today. And there's a couple of reasons for that. And one is that I think communications as a strategy and a way to involve our colleagues who work in communications can really help not only with that external side of things of focusing on engaging people outside of the bird conservation realm, but also can be really useful for the internal work that we do together of ensuring that our conservation recommendations are implemented. And I also want to emphasize that when we talk about communications, I don't mean like just pushing out your message through a press release. That can be a key part of communications, but a lot of the communication science, which itself is its own social science, has really emphasized that we need to move to other models, such as the dialogue model, where we spend our time listening to learn from others and inquiring, not just trying to persuade or change others. And that is really a more effective way to actually see change. Again, there's many ways you can connect with communications professionals. It's excellent to see that many of the bird conservation initiatives have their own communications committee and working group. You can find folks from various organizations who are affiliated with that or have a passion for communications. There's also a lot of well-articulated resources for why engaging in strategic communications is very important. The late 2000s was what I might say is a heyday for emphasizing the role of strategic communications in bird conservation. There were many resources like this All Bird Bulletin that was focused completely on the role of communications in bird conservation that really articulate the value. And I'm happy to say that we've accomplished a lot in this realm, but we still have a way to go in terms of the amount of resources we put towards communications compared to other aspects of bird conservation. There are other resources that you can utilize. Many of the excellent communications professionals, even though their numbers are few, share what they have in terms of resources, have made them widely available on the web, so other organizations can utilize them, such as this great newsroom for Bringing Back 3 Billion Birds campaign that Yoko Chu is going to be speaking about that campaign later on a panel today. And then there's many communications plans that have been developed that really well articulate what would be some best practices for addressing a variety of issues that are relevant to bird conservation, such as this handbook that was focused on young forests, so really relevant to our species like golden wing warbler. And Megan Reese will be talking about efforts that produce these communications plans. She was involved in this one, but we'll be talking about a piping plover one later today. And finally, let's talk about conservation through co-production. We're not merely in the realm of social sciences here, but certainly co-production is fundamentally a human-related issue, and there's social science research that explores this issue. I want to talk about the loading dock model. Some of you may be familiar with that idea, but it's the way we tend to do our science in conservation. And that is, we develop a science product, oftentimes a journal article, maybe a report, and we take it to the loading dock, maybe the journal, maybe it's our online website, and we stick it there on the loading dock, and we hope that a truck comes and carries it off to the manager or the decision maker who might actually use it. Or sometimes we just don't hope that there's going to be a truck. We actually make the truck happen ourselves, and we host a webinar about our research, or we use science Twitter to get it out, or a press release to get it out. But still, we're hoping that it's going to be useful to a manager. Now, this works in the case that there's a manager who knows the questions to be asking and can be looking for the information, and where we happen to have the right research that fits for them at the temporal and geographic scale that they're working at. That's oftentimes not the case. So instead, there's been an emphasis on how we need to switch to a co-production model, where we focus on collaboration among managers, scientists, other stakeholders, or people who are impacted by conservation. And we all work together the whole way through the science process. We identify the decisions that need to be informed by science. We jointly define the scope and context of the problem. We ask research questions together. We develop the methods, the outputs. We together think about how the findings can be applied, and then we develop the strategies for the appropriate use of science. I go beyond the work of Beer and colleagues, and I actually say that we also need to work together to ensure that the strategies are implemented. So let's talk a little bit about some of the key steps in order to accomplish this. The Beer et al. Paper that I cited on the previous slide has a nice set of steps. There's a few that I'm going to call out that I've adapted somewhat based on my experience working with a co-production approach to my own research program. So the first step is that you need to start with understanding the decision a manager is making. And this falls as a responsibility for both the managers and the scientists. The managers need to approach scientists with a management need, a problem, a goal that they're trying to accomplish, not just a product. I'm often asked, can you do a survey for me? And we need to take a step back and ask, why are we doing a survey? Let's instead think about what's the issue or the decision that you're trying to inform with the information you're interested in. And scientists, before they agree to doing a specific product or suggesting a specific product, likewise need to think about the decision to be made, who's going to be making the decision, how's it going to be made, and on what sort of scale. And this can be accomplished through a series of meetings, through a workshop with a variety of the decision makers involved, and even through, we oftentimes will do a survey first and have that as a basis for a conversation if we have a larger group of folks who are the decision makers. Then the other piece that I think is really important to keep in mind related to co-production is I often hear from folks, I don't have time to do that co-production thing. I need to do my science. I need to get my papers out. And that's what's important. And I would say if you have an interest in bird conservation, which I'm sure you all do because you're spending your time here this morning, it is not a waste of time. Ensuring that your science is going to be used and useful is what's most important. And the process is often even more important than the product. There's nothing better than managers already on their way to using your science before your journal article is fully published. And it can also really improve the product that you're going to be creating as well. So this Arthur Ashe quote is a great one for us to keep in mind, that success is a journey, not a destination, and the doing is more important than the outcome. But don't tell my tenure committee that. All right, and then finally, the various levels of engagement and input. It's really important to think about various ways that people can get involved. There might be a variety of stakeholders or managers or decision makers who might have a point of contact with what you're working on that could be involved in various ways in your project. We recently developed a wildlife viewing management plan with the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources. And there were a whole array of ways in which we engaged people in that process. We had a stakeholder committee with all the partner organizations that were interested, or I guess I should say a subset of the partner organizations interested in wildlife viewing in the state. We engaged folks from across the agency, not just people who work in watchable wildlife, but those who might have any sort of action that would come from such a viewing plan. And then we also thought about ways to engage the wildlife viewers. We had focus groups, we had mail and online surveys, and we didn't just talk to the wildlife viewers, we also talked to hunters and anglers who also have an interest in wildlife viewing. And then we did a web-based stakeholder analysis to make sure we were representing the activities of all the organizations in the state that might do something related to wildlife viewing as well. So ultimately then, and I should say, finally, once we had a wildlife viewing plan created, we had a public input process. And we broadly shared that announcement in order to get over 350 people sharing comments on the wildlife viewing plan. So essentially 5,000 individuals and over 200 organizations had some sort of input in the co-production of this wildlife viewing plan for the agency. I have really good hopes that this is going to be used and implemented because so many people are invested in it. And finally, in the process of co-production, there's an excellent literature about how to follow best practices of engaging individuals in any sort of conservation or natural resources activity. Great paper by Reed that I'm citing here at the bottom of my slide. And some of the steps that he calls for in that work is that engagement needs to begin as early as possible and throughout the process. It's not just a one-time thing that you engage with the folks who might be using your science or impacted by your science. You need to agree on clear objectives, that participation needs to be institutionalized and really something that your organization makes part of their culture. And having highly skilled facilitation is essential to ensure that the process is a positive process and also to allow those folks who work for the organization or agency or are the scientists to be able to represent their ideas while someone else is guiding the conversation. All right, so I'm just going to quickly wrap up here with an example that brings this all together, because you might be saying, that sounds great, Ashley, but how do we really make this all happen? So in our work related to shorebird human disturbance on the Atlantic Flyway, my partners and colleagues and I have tried to take an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, I should say, that is also including decision makers, co-production approach to our work. And we've been focused on reducing human disturbance because and really, there's been a huge emphasis on the importance of social science and engaging people, because it's very obvious in this case that the changes in human behavior are what's going to address human disturbance, not changes in bird behavior. So things like leashing dogs, keeping people out of restricted areas, encouraging people to drive appropriately, or maybe not even drive on the beach. And this work builds on other collaborative work within the Flyway. The Piping Plover initiative worked together to create a strategic plan to reduce disturbance, and Megan Racy will be talking about that later today. Similarly, we did some collaborative work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to create a best practices for evaluating and managing human disturbance, specifically during migration in the Northeast. And from those efforts, we then developed a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation funded project that had biological, social science components integrated, involved land managers throughout the whole entire project, ultimately trying to inform strategic engagement of people through community-based social marketing, which incorporates communications as well as other ways to engage people. And in phase one of the project, we collected an array, working with Audubon staff and volunteers, of biological data across the Flyway that really did emphasize the issues associated with the presence of dogs on beach and the number of people on beaches. Not going to share the biological results here today. My focus is instead on the last two reports that I have here. I'm just going to call out a couple of examples of the type of information we found and how that's guided us. So by surveying land managers across the entire Atlantic Flyway of US and Canada, we were able to document what many folks believed was going on, that the management associated with human disturbance is largely based during the breeding season. We also were able to look at what those managers are dealing with in terms of compliance issues at their site. And those where you see more black are where they're facing a larger compliance issue. And so there was a larger proportion of sites saying that they had a pretty strong compliance issue associated with dogs, as you can see here on the right side of the graph. And then we spent a summer, my graduate student did actually, Carolyn Comer, who's done a lot of this work, studying dog walkers and talking to them on beaches in 3 different states across the Atlantic Flyway. in order to be able to look at what are the benefits that people perceive related to the leashing that are most important, and what are the barriers that people perceive related to leashing that are most important, as well as what sort of strategies seem like they'd be most valuable. And she found that norm-based strategies, where you encourage people to think about what others think is what they're supposed to be doing. And so this information can then be used to try to think about how do we maximize people's perceptions of benefits and minimize their barriers. So then we had a phase 2 of the project where we continued on with that data collection, looking at human activities and also bird response. And we also spent some more time talking to land managers, this time in-depth interviews with managers with experience with managing for dogs. And then we did a social science survey of beach walkers across the Atlantic flyway of the US. And our focus in this case was trying to encourage people to walk around flocks of shorebirds during the times of year where they're not having closures on the beach, rather than walking through flocks of shorebirds or sending their kid to run through the flocks of shorebirds. And again, we looked at the barriers and benefits and found that some of the greatest barriers were actually, interestingly, people's belief that there's not an issue associated with this, or their knowledge as to what even are shorebirds and how do I identify them so I can actually walk around them. And problematically, we also found that the distance that people were saying that they're willing to change their path and walk around a shorebird is only up to 40 feet, whereas we know from biological research that the distance that many of these shorebirds are flushing at and maybe disturbed at as well is much broader. So this then allowed us to conduct a co-produced workshop with a lot of the managers we'd previously worked with in the project to together come up with recommended strategies using the community-based social marketing framework. And we now have a phase 3 of the project that will be beginning this fall, where we're going to be piloting this work, working with many of our colleagues who work on the ground, and developing a community of practice where the practitioners and biological and social scientists can continue to have conversations about what's working and what's not working for the implementation. And then we'll also be doing biological and social monitoring and evaluation of the effort, with the hope that we'll have final products of adapted recommendations based on science, a toolkit for other sites to implement, and trainings. But again, our focus is going to be on the process. And many of these organizations that are involved as the pilot sites, we hope will become very skilled at doing this sort of work and be able to carry on this sort of work and also be ambassadors for it as well amongst the shorebird community. With the vision, of course, the hope that we're able to change the trajectory for some of the shorebird species that are in decline. So finally, I want to wrap up with saying that I strive for a future where social scientists are working closely with biologists and decision makers and those that may be impacted by our conservation efforts, and where our bird conservation issues then are more effectively addressed because the human dimensions of conservation are considered. Every day I look at these pictures on my wall of the po'olili. They remind me of why I'm committed to bird conservation, why I work as a social scientist, and why I work so hard to ensure that another species never goes extinct on my watch. And that requires understanding and working with people, and working with folks like you who've committed to spending several days thinking about these issues. I look forward to the rest of our conversations. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ashley, for an amazing talk. I'll be joining Ashley in co-moderating today, and we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience. The first one is, what are the core social science knowledge and skill sets that you would recommend a biologist might develop to help them along this process?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's often sort of Human Dimensions 101 trainings. So many universities now require these for undergraduates. Many of the certifications, like the American Fisheries Society certification and the Wildlife Society, require Human Dimensions basic capacity. And then there's also great places that you can find this, like the NCTC has a training that's like about 4 days long that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service puts on. That's all related to human dimensions as well. So those are all great ways that you can get sort of a broad breadth of human dimensions. And then another way once you start doing those trainings is to start collaborating with social scientists. And if you're co-producing your research together, it's an excellent training opportunity for you as well.
Perfect, thank you. Another question from the audience. There seems to be low public trust in the government, Fish and Wildlife agencies, and some other US government agencies, which translates into this public resistance to what those agencies do. Are there ways that we can leverage some of the things that you talked about in your talk to increase public trust, especially as we work around environmental activism?
Yeah, so believe it or not, there's not actually as low public trust in state fish and wildlife agencies as you might imagine. The North American Waterfowl Management Plan survey of the public showed that it was surprisingly higher than some folks would think. We did a survey recently, as I shared, of people who are viewers, hunters, and anglers, and their trust related to the State Fish and Wildlife Agency in Virginia, and it was actually quite high, and it wasn't predictive of things such as whether or not they were supporting the agency. So we were a little surprised to see that as well, because generally trust in government is something that we hear is low. But I would say that, generally thinking across research associated with trust in government and trust in organizations, that individual two-way conversation is just so critically important. People tend to trust more people that they know. Or people that they have a relationship with. So taking the time to go talk at organizations, civic organizations meetings, or taking the time to be at open houses, et cetera, can just be so critical for people realizing that, yes, there's a person behind that organization's name, and then they can build that bridge.
Perfect. Yeah, relationship building always seems to be the best strategy there. We'll take one more question from the audience, and then we'll move on to our panel. And that question is, do we need to be careful about how we use the term co-production? Is something co-produced if people participate in a survey versus individuals that are part of the decision-making process? And yeah.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So the definition from Beer is that you would think about folks who are the managers, the scientists, and also those that are affected by the decision. And you might have different levels of engagement that's possible for folks. And research has shown that it can be valuable to have varying ways that stakeholder engagement prefers. Some people don't have the capacity or time to be engaged fully and sit on that committee and join you in a meeting every single month for the next 2 years, but some people do. And hopefully the folks that do are sharing back that information with those they represent, and also listening to and sharing the thoughts from those they do represent. So that's obviously a critical part that can't be skipped. But I think having that next layer of opportunities for folks to get involved, like having a survey, can make sure that you're representing a much broader set of voices. And that was the point that I was hoping to make there.
So thanks again, Ashley, for bringing your human dimensions expertise and an amazing plenary this morning. I also want to thank Paul for walking us through the history of Road to Recovery and talking us through a bit about this developing recovery process that we'll be talking so much about the next couple of days. And I think one of the key things, that takeaway message that I get from Ashley and Paul's talk this morning, is the need for a paradigm shift in our approach to species conservation writ large. Uh-oh. Can you still hear me now?
I can still hear you, Brent. You're good.
Okay, my headphones cut out. So, technology is always a challenge.
Yeah.
Anyway, one of the things that Ashley talked about is that we know that the loading dock model to science and conservation hasn't worked well to date. And so through the remainder of today's panels, we're going to be focusing on 3 key approaches that consider the human dimensions of bird conservation. So how do we eliminate that implementation gap that Ashley talked about? And how do we maximize the efficacy of conservation actions for recovery? And so, as Ashley highlighted, we have this implementation gap in large part because we failure to communicate or understand and account for the diverse objectives of stakeholders. That includes scientists, land managers, industry, private landowners, et cetera. And then the second part of it is the failure to build vested interest in conservation outcomes that can then balance those needs among those stakeholders. And so the first panel, we'll be talking about co-production, and we have a group of amazing experts that are going to walk us through the process and examples for how complex conservation challenges can be overcome through through the co-production process. That involves communication and knowledge exchange, partnership and trust building, shared vision, and then ultimately collaborative decision-making. So we're going to hear about translational ecology, co-production, and then the decision science framework. And the thread that links these concepts together is the collaborative process. And I think that we'll be talking a lot about that, from science to conservation decision-making. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first panelist. Sarah Saunders is a quantitative ecologist for the National Audubon Society, where she works as part of the science team to advance bird conservation throughout the Americas. And so today she will be talking to us about translational ecology and how this approach has been used in bird conservation to bridge this research to implementation gap. So take it away, Sarah.
Thanks, Brent, and thank you to Ashley and the organizers for inviting me. And today, I'm going to provide a brief overview of translational ecology and how its 6 principles have been put into practice in avian conservation. And the examples I will share are covered in more detail in our paper that was recently published in Ornithological Applications. So what is translational ecology? It's an intentional approach in which science producers and users from multiple disciplines work collaboratively to co-develop and deliver ecological research that addresses management and conservation issues. And avian conservation naturally lends itself to translational ecology because birds are well studied, they are typically widespread, they often exhibit migratory behaviors that transcend geopolitical boundaries, and they necessitate coordinated conservation efforts to accommodate resource needs and habitat needs across the full annual cycle. So in this lightning talk, I will highlight several case studies from bird conservation that exemplify the 6 core translational ecology principles that have been introduced in previous studies like Enquist and colleagues from 2017 that's shown here. And the 6 principles are collaboration, engagement, commitment, communication, process, and decision framing context. So the first main principle of translational ecology is collaboration, both within and outside of research teams. An example of this as it relates to avian conservation is Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center's Neighborhood Nest Watch program, in which one-on-one exchanges between the scientist and the participant regarding the backyard habitat have provided a strong platform for shared stewardship of both the land and the birds. The second principle of translational ecology is engagement. And one of the most beneficial ways to foster co-production of knowledge is through individuals that are working at boundary spanning organizations. So here I'm showing examples of science producers in purple and science users in blue that are typically involved in avian conservation. Encircled in green are typical boundary spanning entities, including organizations like Audubon that often work at or manage the interface between science producers and users, and they often have dual missions of both information generation and utilization. So because of the collective multidisciplinary nature of translational work, project timelines may be prolonged, which entails long-term commitments by all participants for achieving the required level of trust and accountability. So in the case of this lake in northeastern Turkey, which is home to 232 bird species, the declaration of this area as a wetland of international importance spurred press coverage and visibility, leading to demonstrated commitment by the government to the local community through funding infrastructure and building upgrades. So a project that was initially met with hesitancy by locals eventually led to a sense of ownership and enthusiasm through demonstrated commitment on behalf of all parties that were involved. The use of communication strategies that promote the exchange and integration of knowledge into decision-making is a critical component of the translational process, as Ashley mentioned in her talk. So in one project team, the Intermountain West joint venture partnered with social scientists at Virginia Tech and the University of Montana to conduct day-long landowner listening workshops with the goal of integrating landowners' perspectives into wet meadow conservation plans. And these workshops revealed that landowners face an array of natural, social, and political considerations in maintaining the viability of their ranches. And as a result, the JV and partners are now discussing the complexity of landowner decisions with a full-time communications specialist on staff. Desired outcomes are co-produced through process-driven interactions. For example, recognizing that information gaps may be preventing the integration of bird conservation into management frameworks, Audubon Washington led a collaborative team from the Puget Sound Ecosystem Monitoring Program that hosted 2 regional workshops with participation across state and federal agencies, conservation NGOs, Indigenous communities, and partners in Canada. And workshop participants revealed that institutional capacity and social support are critical for enabling a successful transformation of the current ad hoc approach to avian monitoring. And the team is now developing a regional monitoring framework for the Sound that addresses these stakeholder needs. And finally, co-development of a framework to facilitate decision-making and goal setting across team members allows for adaptive actions and mutual learning. And as an example, the Gulf of Mexico Avian Monitoring Network created a structured decision-making framework with stakeholders to help funding agencies and researchers better understand and incorporate the values of the bird conservation community into proposed Gulf of Mexico bird monitoring projects. And this framework centers on the bird monitoring portfolio selection tool that is shown there on the right. And that synthesizes the values of stakeholders and it can be used to score potential monitoring projects. And our next panelist, Sarah Converse, will speak on structured decision-making in a little bit more detail. So that was translational ecology in a very small nutshell. So please check out our paper for more details and feel free to reach out to me if you'd like a copy. And thank you to my team members of co-authors for all their input and expertise, and to you for listening. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for the excellent presentation, sharing with us co-production from a translational ecology lens. I think we're going to go on to our next speaker, but if you have questions for Sarah Saunders, make sure you're putting them in the Q&A section. We're going to bring back out our 3 panelists after their lightning talks, and we'll have an opportunity for a dialogue with them and with them amongst each other. So Sarah Converse is joining us from USGS, Washington Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, where she is the unit leader and an associate professor at University of Washington. Sarah is going to be providing an overview of decision analysis and how collaborative decision analytic processes promote fruitful co-production of science and conservation implementation. So Sarah, go ahead and bring up your presentation, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to be here and talk to you about one of my favorite topics, which is decision analysis. And I really enjoy talking about this because I've seen how it can transform science into conservation and really transform people who are dedicated to seeing conservation change, getting them to action. So Ronald Howard, now retired, was one of the most sort of influential decision analysts of the 20th century. And he liked to say that decisions are the only means you have to change your future life. This is a really simple, but really profound statement. And the same is true for conservation. The only thing that's going to change our conservation future is if the people who have the power to make decisions make the right decisions to change the state of the system for the birds that we care about for the better. So this is the space that I think that we should really be thinking about working in. How do we engage in such a way as to make sure that the decisions that are made in the most effective way possible? So I want to make 3 sort of overview points about decision analysis. The first is sort of to give you a sense of really what it is. There's a large field of study, decision science, and the normative branch of decision science is concerned with how people can make decisions more effectively. And the application of that science is known as decision analysis. You may also have heard the term structured decision making, which is really the same thing, and a term that's often used in natural resource decision-making. A primary precept of decision analysis is that we can decompose decisions into their component parts. And through that decomposition process, we accomplish a couple things. One is that we separate values from science in a way that helps us to gain clarity about the roles of those different things in the decision-making process. And also through that decomposition, we're able to identify the impediments to decision-making. And once we identify what it is that makes the decision hard, we have a whole bunch of tools that we can bring to bear on those impediments to help decision makers deal with the challenges in decision-making. And then last, I just want to make the point that a collaborative decision analytic process really lends itself well to creation of science that's most relevant to the decision at hand. And this is because in decision analysis, we consider very precisely how we'll use science before we do science. So I talked about the idea of decomposition of decisions as this sort of foundational precept of decision analysis. And this framework that I'm showing you right now is a sort of standard way of seeing that decomposition process. People who've thought about decisions recognize that all decisions are made up of this consistent set of component parts, and those component parts are shown in the ovals on this diagram. So first of all, we need to know what decision we're making. What is the decision problem that we're facing? Who's making it? When do they have to make it? What's their power to take action, and so on. And this is something that both Ashley and Sarah have already started to address this morning, this idea of defining what the decision is. Next, we need to know what it is that we're trying to achieve, articulate the objectives that we have. What is it that we want in making a decision? And oftentimes we want many different things. Sometimes those things conflict. We have to recognize that and really lay out all of those objectives. The next step is to identify the alternatives available to us. So given what we want to achieve, what is it that we can do? What are all the things that we might consider? Laying those out and really using that as an opportunity to be creative. The best solutions that we are going to have are only going to be as good as the best solutions that we propose. And then the next step is where the science really comes in. This is the step at which we're predicting the consequences of those actions in terms of the objectives. So if I do this, what will the outcome be in terms of things I care about, like bird conservation? Once we have that information, we can sort of solve the problem. We talk about this as dealing with trade-offs between certain actions and uncertain actions, trade-offs between different objectives, and so on. And then I'll just also mention that adaptive management is really just a special case of decision analysis or structured decision-making, in which we have this additional sort of inner loop where we decide and take action, and then we monitor and learn, and then go back into the prediction of consequences, trade-offs, and deciding again. So we can make decisions over and over and over. For example, a decision that we have to make every year. So there's a lot of different applications of decision analysis to bird conservation in North America and beyond. And I'm just going to talk briefly about one of those, and that's the application to whooping cranes, in particular whooping cranes in the reintroduced eastern migratory population, which was established starting in 2001, using ultralight-led migration to train captive bred birds to migrate between the upper Midwest and the Southeast of the US. An ongoing challenge in this population since the beginning has been reproductive failure. Birds started nesting in 2005, but due to a combination of nest failure and chick mortality, the number of fledged birds in the population through, within 10 years of the start of breeding was still really small. And so we used, starting in around 2009, we used an iterative decision analytic process to combat this sort of series of challenges leading to reproductive failure. And this process included articulating the decision to be made, articulating the objectives, and then starting in a process of developing hypotheses for the reasons for breeding failure and using these hypotheses along with our objectives to develop ideas for what we could do about the problem. So articulating what the alternative actions were available to us. And as I mentioned earlier, I just want to reemphasize, this is such a great opportunity in this process of developing alternatives to be creative about what the solutions might be. We need more creative solutions to our conservation challenges. And then using that information to develop quantitative models where we could make predictions about the impacts of these different actions that we could take on what we expected to our conservation outcomes to be. And then going into the last step, this step of sort of dealing with trade-offs and thinking about things like, what's the best thing that we can do for the money we have available, and so on. So through this sort of iterative process, we've seen major improvements in the conservation outcomes for this population. As I mentioned, sort of through the first 10 years of breeding in this population, we had about 0.7 chicks fledged per year. As of July 6th of this year, we had 6 2021 birds still alive in the population, 4 2020 birds still alive, and 3 2019 birds still alive. And while these numbers aren't huge, they represent a sea change in terms of the hope that this reintroduction can be successful and that this really iconic bird, still the rarest crane in the world, can be brought back and be a functioning part of the ecosystem in Eastern North America. So how do you know if you need decision analysis? I think the way to approach this is to ask yourself, are the conservation problems you're involved in made challenging by any of the characteristics that I want to talk to you about? First of all, are there trade-offs between multiple and potentially competing objectives that make it hard to think about what to do, make it hard for managers to think about what to do? Is there uncertainty about how the system works? Again, that makes it hard for managers to decide what to do. Are there a large set of potential actions that could be taken? Are those actions complex, and are they possibly even unknown and currently haven't been fully contemplated and developed? Or is there simply lack of clarity about what decision needs to be made? All of these are challenges that we see over and over again. And sometimes these challenges are so severe that they lead managers to sort of be paralyzed by the complexity. And what that does, of course, is it cuts off the potential for conservation action. So if any of this seems familiar to you, decision analysis is one of the tools that we can use to help produce what I like to think of as a cognitive map, a map through the complexity to conservation action. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for that great overview of how we can use decision science to reconcile, these competing objectives and come up with these optimal conservation solutions. Our final panelist is David Pavlaki. He is a research scientist at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies and a colleague of mine. Here at Bird Conservancy, he oversees our quantitative ecology team. And David's going to discuss the role of co-production in socio-ecological systems of the Great Plains, where he's thinking about how we maximize sustainability of ranching and ranching operations and agricultural production for human well-being and grassland bird biodiversity. So with that, David, I will let you take it away.
Sorry, I'm struggling to find my presentation here.
So after David's talk, we will be following up with, as Ashley mentioned, a discussion, and we'll be taking questions from the audience. So if you have questions for any of the panelists specific to them or more broad, then we'll be having that discussion as soon as David finishes up.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy for the chance to share my vision for co-producing conservation science for social ecological systems of the Great Plains. From a Native American perspective, the Great Plains, this is our pride and place where no one, nothing ever stands alone. So this is a bit of ancient wisdom is going to, I'm going to follow this thread throughout my talk. This region once rivaled the Serengeti with vast herds of herbivores, but now is almost completely captured by human culture, with 90% of the land area under private ownership. And this region is now characterized by agricultural production, with 31% of the US cereal crop and 50% of the US beef production. Considering extensive habitat loss and degradation, mostly prior to the 1980s, the recovery of grassland avifauna is among the highest conservation priorities in North America. The new conservation debate started with a landmark paper by Cariva and Marvier in 2012. On the one hand, human modification of Earth's ecosystems have accelerated to become as important, if not more important, than natural processes. And so this requires embracing social ecological systems and reframing conservation along human dimensions. Classical approaches to conservation are often ineffective because they primarily focus on the downstream, proximate biological factors, while the ultimate social economic drivers continue unchecked. On the other hand, some are concerned that managing nature for human well-being may promote irreparable attrition and accelerate the current trajectory towards a biologically impoverished future. So this is important. But similar to translational ecology, renewal ecology offers a solution to maximize biodiversity and human well-being under rapid environmental change. And this occurs at the intersection between conservation science, agroecology, and restoration ecology. So here I am using Cariva and Marvier's definition of conservation science for social ecological systems that includes both human dimensions and ecosystem services. Restoration ecology relates to restoring ecological processes and biodiversity in degraded ecosystems, with the caveat that it may not be possible to return ecosystems to historic conditions. And renewal ecology suggests we think about agriculture as an ecological system in addition to food production, economics, and human well-being. And the main point here is that any of the disciplines on their own may be unable to solve conservation problems in the Great Plains. The US Farm Bill is the primary agricultural and food policy tool of the federal government, connecting the livelihoods of farmers and ranchers, food production for human welfare, and conservation of natural resources. So this framework promotes relationship building and co-production between private producers and natural resource professionals, including financial incentives or cost-sharing payments to support traditional livelihoods. And this collaboration represents the decision makers for implementing conservation practices on private land. And it's interesting to think that scientists in this case are not really the decision makers. The practices are then implemented in a conservation plan to address resource concerns. So in a collaboration between private producers, resource professionals, and bird conservancy scientists, we discovered that Farm Bill prescribed grazing and conservation reserve program conserved breeding habitat for 4.5 million birds per year. The y-axis here represents population size in the millions across prescribed grazing and CRP practices at the level that they're implemented in the study area. And so the Farm Bill practices benefited the most vulnerable grassland obligates shown by the orange bars. And then the practices conserve breeding habitat for 5 million birds per year just in a small portion of the Great Plains in the range of the lesser prairie chicken. When we look at the entire Western Great Plains, the Conservation Reserve Program offset habitat and biodiversity loss for 44 grassland specialists. The y-axis represents the average number of species at monitoring sites in the Central Plains, and the x-axis shows the area of land cover in 9 square kilometer landscapes. The blue ribbon shows how avian biodiversity falls off with increasing loss of grassland habitat, and then the green ribbon shows how planting CRP in cultivated cropland can partially offset the biodiversity declines. Spatially explicit predictions in the left panel show where grassland biodiversity is greatest, and the right panel shows the biodiversity benefit of planting 1 square kilometer of CRP within cultivated cropland. And you can see how CRP is able to start filling in the biodiversity holes in the species richness distribution. And then the predictions show where we can get the largest biodiversity outcomes for grassland birds from the program. And using the tools of systematic conservation planning, we can drill down into individual species distributions to prioritize conservation outcomes for irreplaceable components of biodiversity. However, in order to solve conservation problems within social ecological systems of the Great Plains, conservation actions must be integrated with transdisciplinary objectives such as conservation science, agroecology, and restoration ecology. And so using this approach, we might conduct spatial prioritization for various conservation actions given a fixed budget. And a subtle but important point is to move towards prioritizing conservation actions and outcomes rather than simply prioritizing landscapes. In conclusion, effectiveness monitoring or social science on their own may be incapable of solving conservation problems in social ecological systems of the Great Plains. And decision science is likely needed to balance transdisciplinary objectives such as maximizing sustainability of private farming and ranching operations, food production for human well-being, and conservation of grassland bird biodiversity. So that concludes my talk. Thanks for your attention.
David, thanks so much. It's great to see an example with where we solve a complex conservation challenge where the species exist almost exclusively on private lands. So I think we'll have more discussion about that. So we're going to invite all of our panelists back now, and I will just launch right in with the first question that I have, which I think is relevant to all the panelists, and that is, how would an independent researcher or an organization go about identifying who might be the key stakeholders or partners to ensure that you have an inclusive process, that you're building partnerships and trust in a way that you can work towards this interdisciplinary approach? Obviously, we want to have a diverse set of objectives, but how do we identify who those partners might be in terms of this process? And I'll open it up to anyone who wants to jump in on that.
Grant, I can make a try at that. So if the context is sort of an independent researcher, someone who's working on a species or a set of species and is concerned with what's happening and would like to see change affected, I think the number one thing that you have to think about is who has the power to make a decision in this system? Who are those decision makers or potential decision makers who actually has the power, the ability to put resources towards conservation outcomes? That's the number one question. And then you have to have the ability to engage those people or that person in a process. And then beyond that, I think there's a lot of tools in stakeholder analysis that you can use to figure out who else needs to be at the table beyond those decision makers. And I think it's also absolutely critical in a process like this to have an honest broker, to have someone who can be at the table, who can provide sort of the facilitation, lead the discussion, bring people together without having a specific and particular sort of view about what the outcome should be. I think those are all sort of key partners. But yeah, decision makers got to be number one. Who has the power to make change?
I'm going to ask a follow-up question on that, maybe challenge you a little bit there. So if we also think about the people who might be impacted heavily by our work, people who don't have power, And how do we engage them if they might also not have the time, or they might not be bought into our process of what we're doing related to conservation? You know, particularly an example of, we might engage the farmers in a region and be able to have representatives from there, but we might not be able to get the farm workers who also could be impacted by an ultimate decision that's made. How do we address those sorts of challenges? And not just Sarah that has to answer it. Anyone else is welcome to jump in.
I'll make an initial try, and then, yeah, definitely welcome other people's thoughts. I mean, I think that goes into that idea of stakeholder analysis, right? Who's being affected, in terms of sort of how to then engage people. I won't pretend that I am an expert in sort of engaging groups like, say, farm workers or folks like that. I can imagine that when large groups of people are affected, and that there's a sense that those effects are sort of distributed over large groups of people, figuring out who can represent a larger group of people would be really valuable, to have sort of representative or representatives at the table. I think, again, that sense of having an honest broker in the conversation will help to make people who do choose to engage, or who are brought to the table, to feel like their views are valued. But yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I'm interested to hear what other people have to say about that.
I might just volunteer something here. I think I agree with Sarah that it starts with the decision makers, but after that, you know, I think a broader stakeholder input is what's needed. And then a mentor of mine in decision science, you know, told me we can maximize everyone's objectives, you know, in this process. Like, we can take everyone's objectives seriously as a part of this process. So, you know, we may have some core decision-making objectives, and then we open it up to a larger stakeholder group. And so this will require, you know, like the example you brought up with like farm workers or people who are affected, if we have social objectives, then we can figure out how to measure that and include that in the decision-making process, and then understand, you know, how all those objectives work together. And so I think the process is really amenable to bringing in, you know, this diverse voices. And the trick, the devil in the detail, is to figure out how to measure those so that we can evaluate progress towards, you know, meeting those underlying values. So I think the answer to that would be, yeah, absolutely, you have to include some social objectives and figure out how to measure them and how the management actions might affect those.
David, I want to ask a follow-up to that, and to others on the panel. You know, one of the things is, you know, we put forward these approaches, and the value of these approaches is their ability to bring together the diverse objectives and to come up with, you know, what might be an optimal or maximal solution. And I guess what I'm wondering, in any of your experience, what happens when we can't find a solution, conservation solution, that meets one of the stakeholders' objectives, and then it becomes, you know, what we think of as a value exercise. And so I'm wondering if any of you guys can comment on what happens when there's this give and take, and we have to find a solution that might not meet everybody's goals.
I can take a stab at that. I think part of, you know, what comes into reconciling these different objectives that I found to be helpful is really identifying like short-term versus long-term objectives. I think different stakeholders and different parties involved, you know, they have different time horizons for what management looks like, and really being able to differentiate those short and long-term objectives can kind of set this chronological path along the way when we're talking about bird conservation. That's how I envision it. So even if one objective can't necessarily be addressed right away, or maybe on the timeline that stakeholder really is interested in, it could fall into that long-term objective and be more of the broader goal that gets reached. So that's just one suggestion.
And the other thing I might add is part of the process is the willingness to accept other people's objectives. And, you know, so the only way this works is when a group of people agree to entertain or at least let others have their own objectives. And then, you know, I think what happens sometimes in the optimization part is that, you know, there's some sort of compromise that happens. And so, you know, folks have to be willing to go down that, you know, that track. But there may also be thresholds by which we cannot let these social concerns go below this threshold or something.
I'll jump in with another question here as we're still talking about who do you involve and how do you decide how to involve them. Let's think about co-producing science for an issue that might be really large scale, like the full range of a bird species. How do you determine who to involve in science co-production in that sense? And are there different phases? How do you approach that sort of large scale challenge to co-production?
Yeah, that's a challenging one. I think the example that comes to mind that I've been involved with is the Mid-Continent Shorebird Conservation Initiative, which seems to be the best fit for trying to address this really large scale question across many different bird species. And, you know, the approach so far has been kind of an open invitation for anybody to get involved in the workshops. And it's more like a network of individuals. So one invitation goes to one individual and then they think of others that are involved in shorebird work across the Americas and invite those folks to. So I think it's really about, you know, being generous with who gets invited in the beginning, and then maybe those individuals will plug in at different parts along the process if they can't be involved the whole time. But just having that invitation in the beginning is helpful because then they're all at the table and they've been using the open standards for practice of conservation to solicit needs across these different stakeholders and different values and what threats that shorebirds are facing across the Americas. And so really, in order to get that bigger picture to impact conservation at a really large scale, you need to have as wide a net as possible with partners that are involved.
So, you know, you guys have kind of proselytized the benefits of these approaches, but there's an alternate viewpoint, which is that these types of processes can slow down the research process. And I guess what I'm wondering is, you know, how might you guys respond to that critique? Do you agree that it slows things down? Do you think about the slower pace and the inclusion of the diverse partners outweighs that cost? Can any of you guys speak specifically to that?
Yeah, I can take a stab at it. So in my experience, you know, I've sat in rooms frequently in collaborative sort of decision-making processes and sort of gone through a process of sort of collaboratively developing a model of some system and trying to figure out how will we predict, you know, if we do these various things, what the outcomes are going to be. I spent a lot of my time doing that, and I'm constantly struck by how often folks who were doing science that they thought was relevant to the system, unfortunately, that science, it doesn't really end up helping us build that model. And so we're often going back and saying, okay, like, how do we fill in these gaps? How do we develop new science to do this? How do we use expert judgment to fill these gaps? So I guess my feeling is that if it slows it down, but makes it more relevant to filling the gaps that we actually have, the important gaps, that is the gaps in our knowledge that keep us from making effective decisions, I think that's probably a good thing, if anything. So I'm sort of, yeah, in a place of kind of embracing that.
Sounds like it can open up more research questions oftentimes. So
absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree, Sarah. And then the other thing that I'm on this question is that oftentimes, there's an investment upfront to invest in the social aspects of, these group processes. And that's often not built into our research programs. And so that is where a perceived slowdown can happen. But then the impetus for this is to act right now, and as soon as we develop the objectives is to act. And often when we're trying to figure out how to measure these objectives, we're faced with, oh, we don't have those data right now. But the most important thing is to start, with what we know and to do conservation action now, because what I hear so often is that, oh, we don't have enough information to start, conservation. And then this is the real slowdown, actually. Oh, we need this research program before we can start taking action. And so this adaptive management model is to develop the objectives and the core values and start conservation with the idea we're going to learn along the way, rather than say, oh, we don't have enough information to act. And actually, we know a lot. I mean, we know habitat loss is like the major driver for most species, declines. I don't know. This is kind of a paradigm shift in the way we think about research and conservation.
Yeah, just to reflect on that, I mean, I think it's also important to recognize, a lot of times we get into these processes and we're building models and we use a set of tools known as value of information, which is basically a way of assessing how will new information actually help us get better outcomes. And sometimes value of information is high. That is, yeah, we really would do a lot better if we knew more. But there are plenty of situations in which value of information is actually really quite low. And sometimes it's hard to know that until you sort of get into it and, frame the problem and understand the objectives, understand the actions. In fact, it's very difficult to know that until you really get into it and think about those things. We have this, as people who are trained and love doing science, we have this tendency to think that more information is always going to be helpful. It's not necessarily the case. Sometimes we really have the information we need. What makes the decision difficult is other things. The fact that, yeah, there are going to be challenging trade-offs between different objectives and so on. So I do think it's really important to recognize that, sort of going back to what David said, yeah, and just these ideas of information isn't always what's slowing us down.
I want to jump in on this question of sort of institutional barriers that you might face to doing co-production in your work. And we talked about, the perception of individuals that it might be a time sink, but what about if the organization, thinking particularly universities, because I work for one of them, doesn't value co-production and any sort of product that comes from that? What they want to see is science pubs, citations, your index, impact factor, et cetera. How, is there a need for a shift there? How do we make the shift there? What can we do to specifically at organizations like universities that, the focus is really on science as the science product as a key outcome, and maybe other organizations dealing with that same thing?
I can take a stab at it. I'm interested in what other people have to say. I've spent a lot of my career talking to scientists who sort of have those concerns. And what I've found is that it's very possible to do both. I think that if we do science that's relevant, that's going to be of interest to the larger research community. And I also see, an increasing recognition of this and an interest in this. So for example, with the launch of SCB's new journal, Conservation Science and Practice, right? There's a very strong interest in that journal in publishing these sorts of kind of, application, how do we do this stuff in practice? So I think there's increasing outlets for those kinds of things. And I think there's increasing interest. And I think it's I've found it to be very possible to do both the, sit in a room and help people actually get to the point of a decision, but also then take that work and put it in the literature. And I think we should be having that as a goal, because we all still need to learn about how to do this effectively. There is a model, there's absolutely an academic model of, I'm going to lock my door and I'm going to sit behind it and I'm going to write papers. There's going to be a component of the community that wants to do that. But I guess what I would say is I'm guessing that the people that are here today are not really interested in that model. And I think it's very possible to be successful in the conventional sense without taking that model.
Yeah, I think I agree with most of what Sarah said. And one of the points we did raise in the paper that I mentioned on translational ecology was really this need for a paradigm shift, at least inside and outside of academia, related to reward structures. For example, it can be built into the tenure track process a lot more clearly than what it currently is. It should be valued in the same way that publications and grants are valued as well. And we also make the case that kind of like academic transformation can even happen earlier in terms of graduate level or even undergraduate level training. And that's, I think, slowly happening at universities, and, offering more structured decision-making courses or adaptive management or courses that really emphasize co-production. And I think we're seeing that, but it could be integrated even more completely. And by building that kind of foundation and structure really early on when training scientists, I think it'll just, rise up the levels and have more value going forward.
So I want to ask a question about process. The models that you guys have put forward today really only work if we can get the diverse partners and stakeholders to the table, right? So the question is, how do we incentivize underserved communities, or be they farm workers, indigenous peoples? How do we empower those people to want to be engaged in the process and the conservation decision making, so that their views are brought in? Do you guys have any ideas about how you might be able to bring those diverse partners together to ensure that their voices are heard as part of the ultimate decision making process?
I'm not sure if this is an incentive per se, but I think, it's really important in the beginning, if those individuals are brought to the table, to be transparent about flexibility and different approaches to doing science. Western approaches to doing science are different than indigenous communities, for example. So I think, not showing up at the table and kind of outlining this is exactly how this process is going to go, but instead offering those different perspectives and recognizing that there are different approaches, and we need to work to center those different approaches throughout the decision-making process. I think, we'll encourage and empower those individuals to participate a little bit more. It's not exactly an incentive, but I think a lot of times, the decision maker who comes in comes with a certain approach or a certain bias. And I think then that kind of is off-putting to other individuals that don't necessarily follow that same way of thinking. So really being clear about flexibility, I think, is one step.
Yeah, having that unbiased broker seems like a key part of this process.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Brant, I think that is a key part. And then, I think convincing them that, that their objectives are going to be taken seriously, and, and that their objectives are important for, pulling off the larger, the larger conservation effort. It's like indispensable information, and I think this is really the spirit of the process, is that there's a place for everyone's voice. And then I keep hearing the words of my mentor, we will maximize your objective. I mean, we're going to maximize that together with another person's objective or another stakeholder group's objective. And that might result in a compromise, but the objective is to maximize what you care about. And that's an essential part of the process.
David, I just want to ask a follow-up that's relevant to this. You know, some of the work that you talked about involves obviously key federal partners that maybe have the potential for economic incentives. And how might we pull these specific levers and convince the landowners, for example, that we may be able to translate some of the outcomes of this into programs that might be beneficial for conservation and beneficial for their economic bottom line? Can you speak to that at all?
Well, that's very difficult. You know, I mean, I sort of laid out this big vision, but getting there, I think, is going to be very challenging. And, you know, I mean, I guess I just feel like it's so important to understand the private landowners' like interests and aspirations and what they value. And we're actually, in this landscape, we're not going to get anything done without doing something that is that they agree to. And so making sure that their livelihoods are taken care of is part of the problem. You know, I mean, it's part of the problem, and there might be some trade-offs involved with that. But that's why I'm so favorable for these farm bill programs, is that they have some of that built in, where the relationship building and the taking care of their livelihoods. But I think there's more. I think we're going to hear more about these farm bill programs later. There's more we can do with these social aspects of learning how to work with this private sector. And then, but what I'm also interested in is this larger agro-ecological sort of objective, that the farmers are also invested in feeding the planet, right? And we all have to eat. And so unless we're integrating our objectives with those type of objectives, there's no hope. We're only going to be fighting this downstream proximate factors until we figure out how to do that.
Thanks, David, for your thoughts. And it seems like you guys are setting up really nicely the social science session that's going to happen at 2 o'clock today Eastern time. Seems like there's lots of potential to use social science as a tool to help inform the decision science that you're talking about. I want to ask you all, just from your experience, how have you actually seen outcomes change because you focus on co-production instead of taking an approach where you just did your science? Can you each give us one example of a project, and it may be something you already alluded to in your talk, but one example of a project where you did some sort of co-production and the actual policy that changed, or the decision that changed, that you're aware of as a result of your work, maybe just in part. So no need for the full long story of the co-production, but just a little snippet of the impact of co-production.
I can jump in. This is not an example I was directly involved with, but one that Audubon has been involved with for a few years now. But Audubon has the Conservation Ranching Initiative, and essentially, to try and keep this pretty short, it's range ecologists working with ranch landowners to create bird-friendly habitat and help recover grassland birds, but also allow those ranchers to be able to sell their beef at a premium price because they have met these standards for bird-friendly habitat. And Nicole Michael, who's on Audubon Science team, also worked to develop a bird friendliness index. So conducting that science in collaboration with those range ecologists and ranchers to really come up with a metric that can measure the friendliness of that habitat, so we can see changes in the habitat over time and how that's impacting grassland birds, to be able to take that back to the landowners and say, this is how your practices are improving the habitat and impacting grassland birds, I think is really powerful. So if that work was done in isolation without actually talking to those partners and stakeholders, then I think the metric that would be produced would not be very informative for either party or no parties involved. So I think that's a good example of how the work was impacted with that co-production.
David, you want to give us an example?
Well, I could, and I can say that I think my forays into co-production are not fully formed yet. And so, I mean, I think the best way that I could exemplify this is on a couple of different projects where, like, for example, doing effectiveness monitoring of Farm Bill programs and showing, you know, a really incredible effect of what these programs can do to changing songbird populations just in a small area of the Southern Plains. But I guess I just want to say that this is stopping short of the full implementation of co-production, because in some respects, this is putting like a better packaging on the loading dock model. So it's very relevant to the agency. This, you know, it's like bean counting. What are the effects of these conservation actions? Yet the treatment effects are not necessarily being used in a way to improve the efficiency of, you know, conservation in the region. And so I think, you know, what I would like, and maybe this was a really effective co-production. It was working with landowners. We, you know, recruited landowners and built relationship with landowners, you know, and did monitoring on these Farm Bill programs so that we worked with agencies and then understood how it could change bird populations. Yet I feel like there's still a step where the results are used actually to improve the efficiency of conservation and put it next to other objectives.
So I've spoken about pooping cranes already, and I guess I'll just say maybe a little bit more about that, because I do think it's an example of one of the longest term examples of sort of ongoing engagement in sort of iterative sort of decision analysis, research, decision analysis, research, and so on. So going back to 2008, we started holding workshops and looking at the reproductive failure challenge and developing hypotheses, doing value of information analyses. One of those first value of information analyses was looking at the problem of nest failure and nest abandonment, realizing what hypotheses were most useful for us to look at from a value of information standpoint, designing research, learning from that research, and then implementing management. So one of the early sort of victories that we had was what we call the black fly hypothesis, that actually blood feeding black flies were leading to nest failure because of nest abandonment, because of the high load of these flies that birds were experiencing. That led us to realize there was sort of a phenological challenge, and that led us to actually intensive nest management that hugely increased nest success, nest survival. And then that led to a recognition that even when nests were successful, we had another problem with chick survival, which led us to thinking about what it was in the captive production that was leading to chick mortality, and then addressing that. So it has been this sort of ongoing process of identifying a problem and then thinking really hard, what can we do about it? And then doing the science in the context of, is this thing that we thought of possibly that we could do about it, is it going to be effective? Yeah, so that's one where we've seen a real change in terms of the potential for that population to be successful.
It's great. It's a great reminder that we always need to be flexible and adaptive, that solving conservation challenges is never like, okay, we can just inscribe it in stone and we're done with the process. So we're getting close to the hour, and we want to make sure all of our attendees and panelists get a bathroom break. And I do want to remind the panelists that questions that are coming in, we still have the opportunity to answer those in writing in the Q&A. But don't dismiss questions, because we want to have those for the record. So thank you all, and thank all the attendees for amazing questions that have been coming in and have been fed to us through our Q&A moderator. And I guess with that, we will see you all after a 1 hour break. Oh, Paul's got something he wants to
Well,
add.
let me just close it out, Brant, by thanking you, Ashley, Sarah, and David for great conversation, great presentations this morning. Great job. And like you said, thank you for all the questions that were put in. We obviously couldn't get to all of them, but we can, as Brant said, through the responses that'll come along over the next couple of days. And don't forget, on the third day, we're going to have an open forum, which is going to try to capture all of the loose ends as much as we possibly can. We hope today and the next 2 days will help all of us think more boldly, more creatively, be reflective and thoughtful, and so that we can reimagine bird conservation, because it is more than biology or ornithology. After all, conservation requires more than birds on board. We'll take an hour break, as Brant indicated, pick up at 2 o'clock Eastern time, and we'll get further into communications and social science. Please come back. See you then.